Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks to our panelists and to those in the audience. I'm Sarah Kaplan. I'm a climate reporter at the Washington Post, and I'm delighted to be here with leaders from government and academia and industry to talk about the threats that climate change poses to the world's oceans, but also the role that oceans can play in helping us address the climate crisis. We're going to start with introductions and statements from each panelist, and then have 30 minutes of Q&A. And there's a lot of expertise on the Zoom and a pretty big ocean to cover. So I'm just going to get going. Everyone here views the climate crisis as an existential threat to society, perhaps the biggest threat we've ever faced. And everyone from various vantage points sees the way the ocean will suffer from climate change, but also how it can be key in helping us address climate change. So I want to start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and say what you think the world leaders gathered here virtually for the Mission Innovation Initiative should know about the role that the ocean can play in contributing to climate solutions. And why don't we start with Dr. Lubchenco?
My name is Jane Lubchenco. I serve as the Deputy Director for Climate and Environment in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I really appreciate the question, Sarah, and thanks to the Department of Energy for convening this really important conversation in the lead into the launch of Mission Innovation. As you noted, Sarah, we have long understood that the ocean plays a central role in the climate system itself. For example, in absorbing, distributing, and storing heat, and also absorbing carbon dioxide. Recently, scientists and ocean users have documented many of the devastating impacts of climate change on the ocean, from heat waves and warming to ocean acidification and deoxygenation. The conclusions from that are unmistakable. Profound changes are underway in our ocean, profound changes for people and for the planet. But even more recently, we are now beginning to comprehend that the ocean is not only a victim of climate change, but a potential source of solutions. We're flipping the script from victim to solution. Recent analyses have shown that ocean-based climate solutions could provide as much as 21% of the emission reductions that we need to meet the 1.5 degree target by 2050. That's 1/5 of the solutions that we desperately need. 4 of these ocean-based climate solutions include, number 1, ocean-based renewable energy, like wind, wave, tidal, current, and thermal. 2, protecting and restoring blue carbon ecosystems, such as salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass beds. 3, establishing highly protected MPAs that secure the abundant stores of carbon on the seafloor, while also protecting biodiversity and boosting seafood production. And 4, decarbonizing ocean industries such as shipping. In response, policymakers across the globe are taking notice. A recent evaluation of national climate goals under the Paris Agreement found that 37 of 40 submissions from coastal countries included at least one ocean element. That's a good start, but there's much greater untapped potential. That's why we need innovation as a complement to increased awareness. What an exciting time this is for the innovation space. Great need, phenomenal opportunity. But do keep in mind that 2 types of innovation are needed. Innovations in technology, for sure, but also innovations in policy, finance, science, and implementation that enable or accelerate solutions. So in short, until recently, the global community looked only to the land for solutions to the climate crisis. Now, armed with scientific analyses, we are awakening to the possibilities that the ocean holds. And frankly, those possibilities are exciting, which is why that in my role as Deputy Director for Climate and Environment and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, I'm working with colleagues across the US government to help realize this full potential of ocean climate solutions. And as Special Envoy Kerry and others have noted, our ocean and climate are connected and interdependent. We depend on both. No more silos, no more stovepipes. And so I say to the world leaders gathered here for Mission Innovation, it's high time that we accelerate innovation to enable ocean climate action.
Thank you so much. Sue, do you want to take the virtual microphone next?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm Sue Biniaz. I'm at the State Department, and I'm supporting Secretary Kerry in his new role as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, or SPEC for short. It's great to be in this event, and it's been great to see how widespread ocean-based climate action has become, both within the U.S. government, in other governments, and among non-state actors. And I'm going to start with a few words about U.S. Climate diplomacy in this administration. We left Paris in 2015 with the aim of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees while pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5. And since that time, including because of the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, it's become blindingly clear that we need to lean into the aim of 1.5 degrees. So we in the SPEC office are doing everything possible to try to keep the 1.5 limit within reach. And that's our goal for the upcoming Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, i.e. to make substantial progress toward keeping 1.5, sometimes we say in sight, within reach, or on the table. We know that climate diplomacy begins at home, and that U.S. domestic action is necessary not only to do our part substantively, but to restore credibility internationally with our partners. And in that regard, President Biden announced at his recent Leaders Summit on Earth Day that the U.S. would submit a nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement of reducing emissions by 50 to 52% in 2030. And that's an ambitious decline, which will put us on a path to net zero no later than 2050. And I say this because we're very aware that climate ambition is the single most important thing we can do to protect the ocean and the communities that depend on it. And as Secretary Kerry often says, climate action is necessary for ocean protection. But as Jane just said, on the flip side, we also know that ocean action is necessary for climate protection, which is why if you look at the cover note of our NDC that we submitted to the Paris Agreement, we make very clear the important role that is played by scaling up offshore renewable energy, reducing emissions from shipping and ports, and advancing natural climate solutions such as protecting and restoring blue carbon. In terms of diplomacy, one last point. It's important to realize that the U.S. Share of global CO2 emissions is less than 15%. So it's imperative, it's critical that we work with other countries, especially the major economies and emitters of the world, to raise global ambition. So we are injecting climate change very broadly into our bilateral and multilateral climate diplomacy. And President Biden's summit, the one I just mentioned, it gathered the world's largest economies and emitters, brought about many ambitious announcements, and provided needed momentum towards the COP in November. Thanks.
Digger, do you want to take the question next?
Thanks, Sarah. When you think about innovation, we oftentimes think about research and development. And research and development are very important things to work on, and the Department of Energy spends billions of dollars a year on research and development. But as Jane suggested, innovation has to also become commercialization and deployment. And the Loan Programs Office is the office that I direct as the director of the Loan Programs Office here at the Department of Energy. We have about $46 billion of existing authority and have a pretty wide mandate to support innovative technologies and their deployment at scale. One of the things that I believe that we continue to miss is that the cost reductions that we've seen in solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries are in fact a fundamental law of science and the learning curve and not actually just a matter of surprises around cost reduction that came out of nowhere. And so one of the areas that we're focused on is in offshore wind technology. Offshore wind technology leverages the ocean and its important proximity to many of the Earth's largest populations, and reduces substantially the transmission constraints that we have in bringing solar power and other onshore wind technologies to coastal areas. And so when you think about the potential of offshore wind and tidal and wave technologies, what you find is there's enough potential that has been fully identified today to meet 100% of the electricity needs of the European Union, the United States, China, Japan, and India. And so when you think about tools by which to give the countries of the world the confidence that they can actually provide a modern lifestyle to their populations while meeting aggressive decarbonization goals, we believe that innovation and the scale up of innovation are a critical tool in providing that level of confidence to the world's leaders in order to present bolder goals. The other area that we are exploring, even though we are the Department of Energy, it happens to be the case that there is a lot of energy used in the production of food. And when you think about the world's food production and its impact on climate, one of the areas of growth is sustainable seafood and the way in which we can actually help supply the calories of the world through sustainable seafood. And these are also technologies that qualify under the Loan Programs Office. Our mandate is really to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the deployment of technology. And so that technology is not just in electricity production, but it also can be in lower carbon footprint and more environmentally friendly food production. And so when you think about how broad innovation really needs to reach to be able to meet the needs of all of the countries around the world, including the United States of America, it's essential for us to think broadly about carbon reduction and innovation across the many sectors that produce carbon pollution today.
And Lee, we've heard from, three folks in government. Can you maybe talk about the private sector and your approach to looking at the ocean and climate interaction?
I'm Lee Kinberg. I'm head of environment and sustainability for North America for Maersk, which is a global shipping company and a logistics company. Now, COVID has made us all very aware of the vital role supply chains play and how complex they are. Ocean shipping is a critical part of that global supply chain. We move 90% of the world's cargo. And in doing so, we generate between 2 and 3% of the man-made carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. So we are part of the problem, and we are determined to be part of the solution. And those major cargo owners who are our major customers, those shippers, are demanding net zero carbon shipping. We don't exactly know what that means yet, but that's where we're all trying to go. Now, we've set a goal of 2050. Many of us have set goals for 2050. And that sounds like a long-term fluffy goal, but the reality is it is not. The lifetime of an ocean-going vessel is 20 to 30 years. 20 to 30 years. So what that means is that these decisions need to be made now. These investments need to be made this decade. The need for solutions and actions is urgent. Now, our vessels travel the world, so we have to have international rules, or it would be so fragmented that it would be unmanageable. Shipping now has global goals for reductions set through the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. So if I say IMO, that's what I'm talking about. And those rules are currently being negotiated in terms of exactly how do you do it and how do you measure it? How do you determine the progress? So that's actually happening this year. So this is all very current, very pressing, not something long-term and fluffy. This is a really major sea change for shipping, as big as the move to containerization or from steam to diesel. It's that huge. And doing that is not something any one company can do by ourselves. So we're all trying to figure out, how do we work together? How do we develop the technologies, the fuels, and the landside infrastructure that has to support those vessels to make all of this happen on this, what is actually a fairly fast-paced change. So again, as we said, we don't know how to do it all. Collaboration is key. We're working with our major customers. Fuel suppliers, technology providers, government agencies are very critical, and many others, to create that transformation. We believe it can be done if we do it together.
And Jyotika, can you tell us about the sort of nonprofit and philanthropy side?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Sarah, to this conversation about the incredible asset our ocean is to the global economy and climate. I'm Jyotika Virmani. I'm the Schmidt Executive Director at the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and I've been here for just over a year. And prior to this, I was with XPRIZE for 6 years. So through both organizations, what I'm bringing here is that perspective of the role of philanthropy and partnerships in driving marine innovation and research forward. So it's already been said, we're living in an era where technological innovation is happening globally in an exponentially faster pace. And this allows us to explore and understand for the first time some of the most difficult to reach parts of the world. So the Schmidt Ocean Institute is a philanthropic operating foundation. It was established by Eric and Wendy Schmidt in 2009, and we currently operate a research vessel, Falkor. And we provide this research ship and its onboard assets at no cost to scientists internationally, in exchange that we ask that they make their data publicly available as quickly as possible, under the principle that the faster data is available, the faster our understanding of what is happening, and so the faster we can react. And this is something that we've all just lived through with this pandemic, as we've seen unprecedented data sharing and rapid vaccine development as a consequence. So last year saw many field operations come to a halt, but we were able to continue seagoing operations throughout the year as we carefully pivoted from our well-laid plans and schemes to new plans. And so another thing that philanthropy can also provide and bring is the ability to react very quickly. And as a result, last year, those aboard our vessel, those working remotely, found the longest known sea creature, dozens of new species, and even a new coral reef, which was healthy on the Great Barrier Reef. But philanthropy doesn't just support research and exploration. One of the capabilities that's made ocean more accessible in recent years for scientists and the general public is remotely operated unmanned and autonomous technologies. So, for example, Saildrone is an uncrewed surface vessel that can gather data in remote places such as rough winter seas around Antarctica. And Saildrone was an early grantee from the Schmidt Marine Technology Partners. So philanthropy also provides support in potentially high-risk investments in early stages of technology development to address some of these challenges. Another example is a remotely operated surface vessel is SeaKit, the winning entry from the Shell Ocean Discovery XPRIZE, which was a competition for innovations to map the seafloor faster and at a higher resolution. And this technology can now deploy and recover an AUV remotely with no humans at sea. And this was just an engineering diagram 4 short years ago, which shows how quickly technology is coming online. This technology, by the way, has over 90% less fuel consumption compared to previous ways of doing the same work at sea, the same mapping work. Part of this XPRIZE was a bonus prize from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for autonomous underwater biological and chemical signal detection technology, which was won by a junior high and high school student team, which shows that innovation is actually also coming from all ages, which is really hopeful for our future. So competitions can definitely solve some of the tough challenges that we have and that we face. And this XPRIZE was a great example of a partnership between government, industry, nonprofits, and academia to spur rapid innovation. Currently, approximately 95% of coastal nations have very little ability to explore their own deep waters, which is problematic for those nations to be able to understand and manage their own resources. To understand our ocean and climate and spur the economy, We really need this human ingenuity and innovation, but we also need to partner and work together openly to make rapid progress that we need to ensure we can thrive in balance with this planet. Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll finish off with Jason.
Thank you. Great to be with you all. And such an important conversation to be having, how to think about the role of policy and innovation and technology and work in multidisciplinary ways across civil society, nonprofits, and of course, government, and where I sit in academia at Columbia University. So I am the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, and that idea, creating a school of climate change in and of itself, I think is one of the ways we think about the need to be not just interdisciplinary, but anti-disciplinary and work across all the different aspects of this problem you've heard about already: science, engineering, law, business, policy, technology, international relations, foreign policy, and much more. I want to come back to that in the discussion, hopefully, and hear more from my fellow panelists about it. But the question you started with, where we see some of the greatest opportunities for oceans to contribute to decarbonization, I'll focus. Of course, we have colleagues across Columbia at places like Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which runs the flagship research vessel for the academic community, the LANXEF, and much more climate science work being done there. But talk about the work I focus on in energy, and there's a lot to say about that, but let me make 3 quick points. Obviously, offshore wind is a huge area where the oceans will supply zero carbon energy. We have huge potential for renewable energy there. Offshore wind is unique as the only variable baseload power generation technology. They have capacity factors that rival that of efficient gas-fired power plants. And with capacity factors that high, offshore wind is attractive not only to generate electricity, but to turn that electricity into molecules as green hydrogen or ammonia. And those zero carbon synthetic fuels are also going to be critical for deep decarbonization pathways in steel or cement or shipping or other sectors. The opportunity is huge. The total potential for offshore wind is nearly 20 times that of all global electricity demand today. The second area I'd highlight is carbon capture and storage. There's almost no model for achieving 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees at this point that does not include significant amounts of carbon capture and storage and carbon removal through direct air capture or another means to achieve net zero. The ocean obviously can hold a lot of CO2 through biological, chemical, electrochemical means. You can also capture and inject CO2 in the ocean floor. My Columbia colleague Dave Goldberg, for example, has found that CO2 injected into cooled volcanic rock under the ocean can react chemically with them to form minerals like limestones in vast quantities. Or another colleague, Peter Kellerman, has studied how pieces of oceanic crust can remove CO2 from the air through carbon mineralization. Other options being studied at Lamont include adding alkalinity to the ocean. And the continental shelf of many nations is where CO2 is and can be stored, like the North Sea. Nations have jurisdiction over their coastal waters. Think of the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. And these resources will be hugely important for several African nations, for India, for Malaysia, for Indonesia, for Singapore, a range of other countries. And I think there's real value in international capacity building and cooperation to assess these opportunities and take advantage of them. And finally, I would just echo what we just heard, which is in shipping. Obviously, oceans are where decarbonization of parts of transportation are going to happen, and one of the harder parts of the transportation sector to decarbonize. Around 6 to 7 million barrels a day of oil are used in global shipping today, and that number is growing. Decarbonizing shipping is harder than something like passenger cars. Batteries may work in local or short distance vessels, but less likely to be the solution for long distance shipping. So there, we're going to need zero renewable or other zero carbon energy stored maybe in a different way than batteries, say as green ammonia. which is a very promising alternative to shipping fuel. And those ships can then actually move those molecules around to help supply the fuels that will be needed to decarbonize other sectors, like steel or cement, as we saw a few months ago when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia delivered a shipment of green ammonia to Japan. So those three areas, offshore wind, carbon capture, and shipping, are just a few of many areas in which, when it comes to decarbonizing the energy system, which is critical for achieving net zero, of course, oceans are going to play a really important role.
Thanks so much, Jason, and to everyone for those interesting answers. I wanted to start the sort of Q&A portion with a question for Jigar. Like Jason just mentioned, the capacity of offshore wind is incredible, way more than the amount of electricity we currently use. And so, what is the DOE and the Loans Program Office doing, or what would you see as the barriers to actually meeting or taking advantage of the capacity, the potential capacity of the offshore wind, and what is DOE doing to try to support and promote that? And then also, what are some of the kind of more surprising ways in which the Department of Energy is getting involved in the ocean space? I think people know a lot about wind, but are there other potential energy sources that you see in the ocean that you're excited about?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. In general, I'd say that offshore wind today is on the trajectory. So I think people recognize that the costs are coming down, that today offshore wind will be cost competitive with modern sources of electricity and will be able to transmit that electricity directly to coastal cities where 40% of all humans in the world live within 100 kilometers of a coastline. I think that the other areas where we find a lot of interest is in long distance transmission. So when you think about where the government of Australia is looking to work with Singapore to provide them with 100% electrification through solar from Australia, we think that those types of projects are quite fascinating, and ones where our R&D efforts and other long-term efforts have been quite useful. I think the other area I would say is very interesting is air conditioning, and as the world continues to warm, being able to make it comfortable for people who live along the coast will be important. And one of the easiest ways to provide district heating and cooling is through oceans, and using the heat sink within oceans to provide that heating and cooling for buildings. And so when you think about decarbonization at scale, there are a number of pilots that are happening and technologies that are being pursued in ocean-related heating and cooling.
That's super interesting. Is there one particular pilot that you think is sort of worth spotlighting?
Well, there's several. Unfortunately, none of them have been completed yet. But there are two major projects, one in the Caribbean and one off of Oahu in Hawaii, that are worth watching. And I think that they're largely being developed for hotel loads, which, as you can imagine, are severely impacted by COVID this last year. But we do see a return of travel here in the not so distant future.
And Lee, I'm thinking about the opportunities and the challenges facing the maritime industry, which, like you mentioned, is a major contributor to emissions and also is considered kind of a particularly hard to abate sector. I know that there have been a number of schemes proposed to tackle this issue, including the IMO recommending a global price on carbon. And I'm just curious, sort of, what are the opportunities that you see for the shipping industry to move away from fossil fuels, both in how ships themselves are fuels, but also what happens at ports? And then what approach do you think is most likely to get the industry to that target of decarbonizing by 2050?
Well, thanks. Let me talk short, intermediate, and long term. On the short term basis, energy efficiency. If you don't use the energy, you don't have to pay for it. But also, if you use half the fuel to move a piece of cargo a certain distance, then you cut the carbon footprint in half. So the math is that simple. So energy efficiency is work that's been underway for over a decade. The Clean Cargo Working Group has worked hard for many years to put together metrics and develop industry averages and accelerate this work for the container shipping business. Since 2008, we have reduced our carbon dioxide per container per kilometer by 46%. So that's basically cutting the fuel used in half. So cutting the carbon footprint in half. Our 2030 goal for energy efficiency is 60%, but energy efficiency won't get you all the way to zero. You just can't do it. So now to midterm, first we have committed to the 1.5 degree commitment. We've signed the Global Compact commitment. We are also already providing for the last year a biofuel-based net carbon neutral shipping product for some of our major customers. So they have stepped up to the plate and are actually paying a premium to help support this effort and split the cost of that more expensive biofuel with us and actually demonstrate that this can be done and get the data on how this can be done. Now, in terms of now to midterm, that will take us a ways, but again, it won't get us all the way to zero. So longer term, we have to totally transform the industry from a fuels and energy perspective. In December of 2018, our board set a goal of zero carbon across our entire fleet by 2050. We considered it a moonshot goal at the time, and we committed to have the first vessel on the water in 2030. Again, getting very near term for us. Last month, we announced that first zero carbon neutral vessel will be on the water in 2023, 7 years early and 2 years from right now. So that's quite an acceleration, but we're beginning to see the pathways that even this difficult to decarbonize sector can actually make this kind of progress. The other commitment that we made at the time that didn't get all the press attention was an even bigger commitment, which was that all of our new vessels from this one going forward will be capable of running a carbon neutral fuel. So they'll have dual fuel capability. They'll have, as long as needed, that backup of a conventional fuel, but all of them will be built to operate net carbon neutral. So to us, that is an even huger commitment because we operate 750 vessels around the world at this point. We're also collaborating with our customers, universities, other companies to develop those fuels for the future and that infrastructure that's going to be necessary to supply them because they're going to be more than one winner. And where are today's ports going to put the infrastructure to deliver those fuels to the vessels? The investment on the land side may be much greater than the investment needed even for all the new vessels to do this. We're looking at things like alcohols, alcohol lignin blends. We're looking at green ammonia. There's some work happening with our parent company in Denmark on hydrogen. So we're not ruling out any real pathways. Today, we are doing a lot of work with biofuels. Again, global standards and regulatory structures are essential to make all of this work. You've got to have the classification societies, you've got to have the ISO standards, so those kinds of things have to happen. You've got to have the IMO rules of the road because we've got to do this safely. Some of these products are more flammable than current fuels. Some of these products are toxic. How do we keep our people safe? How do we keep the ocean environment safe with these changes in fuels? Are there unintended consequences? So these are all things that we've committed to try to understand, and that's why we've committed to put this first vessel on the water so quickly and to get that data and to signal, just as our customers have signaled to us, yes, this is real, we are signaling to the fuel suppliers, yes, this is real. If you build it, there will be ships to use the fuels. And we think that together, again, we can do this, but it's going to have to start now.
You made some great points there. One thing I just wanted to highlight was that the land-based investments will be substantial. And you're already seeing a number of ports working with us at the Loan Programs Office to green all the drayage trucks that, that ship the last mile from the ports to their final ports of destination, as well as all the equipment on site. And a lot of that, those fuel choices are being coordinated with the fuel choices of the ships as well. So a lot of moving parts, and the level of coordination has been truly impressive.
You're exactly right, Jigar. And we have to look not just port to port, but factory all the way to consumer. And put all of those pieces together so that you have actually a zero carbon supply chain and not just bits and pieces. And that's why it's all got to be coordinated, because we move between modes. If we do something in trying to achieve IMO goals, for example, that say slows down shipping, and only 4% of the cargo moved by ship moves to air freight, you'll wipe out all the savings of all of the ocean shipping. So we've really got to be careful what we measure. We've really got to look at this holistically and not just in these silos. I think one of you mentioned getting out of these silos, breaking down, or several of you mentioned breaking down the silos. And that's going to be essential to make this all work.
Moving from what's on top of the ocean to what's in it, I was hoping we could sort of tackle some of the scientific questions. And Jyotika, several people have mentioned this intimate connection between ocean and climate, how the ocean has absorbed much of the excess carbon and heat that human actions have put into the atmosphere, but then is also feeling the consequences in marine heat waves and coral die-offs and other adverse effects. And I'm curious, what do you see as the big scientific questions that remain to be answered in understanding that interaction? And then how are we what are the answers that we need to find in order to become better stewards of the ocean and utilize its power as a carbon sink?
Thank you, Sarah. That's a very encompassing question. So I think, I think the ocean is really complex on its own. And then you weave in the atmosphere and the earth. The whole system is extremely complicated. So I think we have two challenges ahead of us. One is the complexity and understanding the complexity. But pushing against that is time. And it's, it's been said before, we've only got a limited amount of time. We know what's happening on a grander scale. So there are a number of solutions that have been proposed, biomimicry as well as geomimicry solutions that, as Jane started this conversation with, the ocean has that ability to provide solutions to our climate issues, and those are some of them. But what we don't know are the full consequences of those. So implementing something that then runs away from us is one area. So really trying to get research and a handle on what's the best path forward, and what's the path forward that will provide the most scalability, the most impact, and also actually perhaps the least external energy use, because we don't want to propagate that issue. So those are some of the areas of research as far as being able to tackle and draw down carbon dioxide into the ocean. Is what is the impact for some of these solutions that are being proposed? And that includes the ecosystems effect, it includes the life cycle impacts, the benefits. And then there's also and I can't remember who said this, but it's not just innovation in technologies, it's innovation in finance and policy. And I think that might be Jane as well, actually, but it all weaves together. And so there's actual research yet to be done in what is that, who is able to take up the technology. It's not in isolation, as Lee said, it's not in silos. So I think there's a lot of areas of scientific research, but I wouldn't want to just cordon it off and separate it from anything else. I don't know if that answered your question, kind of.
Well, that's actually something that maybe both you and Jason can weigh in on is, there's all these big ideas out there, lots of exciting potential proposals. But the question is like, where are the resources going to come from? How do you set up the economic incentives and infrastructure to promote uptake and scale these ideas? And so, you know, where are the big, or what are the barriers? And what do you both think are sort of the possible solutions for creating a framework in which all of these ideas for both decarbonizing and developing the ocean as a carbon sink, you know, can actually come to fruition?
I'll let Jason.
You want me to go first? Okay, sure.
Yeah, please do.
I'll take it first. I think it's a big part of what we talked about already, which is innovation in policy, finance, as well as technology, and also this question of how you really work across disciplines and bringing together the private sector with academia, with government, and getting the whole government to work together. I think the point, I think it was Jigar who really emphasized that it's not just about the basic research and R&D done in our extraordinary national labs here in the U.S. government, but commercialization and deployment. I actually think one of the most important parts of the Biden infrastructure proposal, even though it's not the largest dollar amount or get the most attention, is funding toward demonstration projects and deployment. Federal R&D needs to be larger for clean energy, and it is much broader than just the Department of Energy. It's defense and agriculture and NASA and the National Science Foundation, and figuring out how to work across the entire innovation ecosystem with federal labs and universities and private ventures and state and local governments to build regional clusters of excellence. And then you need the policy incentives to make that happen, because in many cases, not all, it is more expensive to figure out how to move the shipping sector in a zero carbon direction than not. With a few exceptions like enhanced oil recovery, there are not economic incentives to not emit CO2 into the air when you're undertaking some other activity, or to remove CO2 from the air and store it. That doesn't happen without policy requirements to do it, either a carbon price or a clean electricity standard or some other that is the role of government to make sure that we're not polluting and harming others when we're undertaking those activities. So the significant investments in innovation, and those cut across all the three things, I mentioned, and many more, of course, but expanding, say, offshore wind with new technologies to improve efficiency, data science for predictive resource mapping and maintenance to reduce costs. In carbon capture, we have a lot of work to do to advance the technology and bring costs down. Certainly that's true with some of the zero carbon synthetic fuels or the other options we heard Lee talk about that Maersk is pursuing. So we're going to need to pursue all of those things and really pursue them in a multidisciplinary way, working across all vectors of this problem. Again, we kind of have an innovative experiment here with what we're building in a climate school at Columbia to try to do that, recognizing we're not going to make the progress we need if the engineering school just works on its own, and a law school and a business school and the scientists at Lamont. We need to come together to figure out what solutions look like across all these dimensions.
Can I add to that? So just to add on some of what Jason said, I think, and to answer your question a bit, was I think through examples like the X Prize, it is possible to have multi-sectors involved. What you need to do is set a clear common goal that everyone agrees to, which I think we're heading in that direction if we're not already there. One of the challenges, though, is, and I think you asked, what are the challenges to this, is that we all operate at a different speed. So, and I mentioned this, we can, like in philanthropy, we can operate relatively quickly. Governments are slower, academia is in a different pace. And that is a challenge, actually, which is not often recognized, is to align those together so that we can all march in step and achieve that kind of resonance to make an impact. So I think that's an area that needs to somehow be addressed on how can we all work together once you've identified what the common goals are that we want to crack and achieve.
My next question is for Jane. You mentioned at the beginning the very ambitious goals that this administration has set related to ocean-based climate action, whether it's developing offshore wind or pursuing zero carbon shipping or investing in coastal restoration projects. And you've also spoken about the sort of these various priorities or pillars of ocean solutions. So, food production, carbon dioxide removal, offshore wind energy, and decarbonizing transport. But sometimes those priorities can come into conflict, right? Like we know that noise pollution from both shipping and from offshore wind can affect ecosystems, can affect fisheries. What do you think the administration's approach is or should be to kind of balancing these four priorities, and what's the role of science in helping to achieve that balance?
Yeah, so really good question, Sarah. Thank you. In truth, reaching the ambitious goals that the Biden administration has laid out really requires an all hands on deck approach that will, as people have already noted, require partnerships, cooperation, and compromise across the agencies, but also with industry, NGOs, and anybody else. And I think maybe looking at offshore renewable energy is a good place to start. Technological research and development are absolutely required to have robust technologies that will maximize energy capture. But at the same time, ecological data are needed to help minimize, mitigate, and monitor potential negative environmental impacts. Similarly, siting decisions, so where are we going to put these, have to be made not only to maximize energy capture, but to really ensure deconfliction of the multiple other uses of the ocean space. And so the federal government really needs to support opportunities for dialogue across these different perspectives. And the Biden administration's focus on not only reducing, tackling the climate crisis, but also creating good jobs and paying attention to environmental justice issues really goes to the heart of this need for integration across these different elements so that we can have a solution that works across the board.
And so you, thinking about this from an international perspective, I'm curious what you think what work remains as far as crafting international agreements or strategy for achieving that kind of balance and those kind of generally agreed upon goals like Jyotika mentioned to protect oceans and cultivate ocean solutions. And then I also was hoping that you could touch on what are the obligations of countries like the United States, which is, has produced most of the more emissions that are currently in the atmosphere than any other nation, and of polluting industries to help communities that are suffering right now the impacts of climate change, whether it's sea level rise or more extreme and frequent hurricanes. How do we help build resilience and make sure that their economies that are dependent on the ocean are also safe?
Well, thanks for that question. Let me mention three specific opportunities that we are pursuing in the near term. So one echoes what Liu talked about, which is trying to put international shipping on a pathway to decarbonization by mid-century. An interesting fact, I think, is according to the latest data, international shipping, if it were a country, would be the 8th largest emitter. And between 2012 and 2018, total emissions from that sector increased nearly 10%, and they're expected to rise even further if you don't adopt low and zero carbon fuels. So in part for that reason, the US recently announced that we're committed to working with other countries in the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to adopt a goal of zero, and not net zero, but zero GHG emissions for the sector by 2050, which in turn supports the goal of keeping 1.5 alive. And in that connection, we would be working within the IMO, not only to get the goal put in place, but to work on measures in the long-term and midterm to try to promote, achievement of that goal. So that's kind of number one. Number two is on the resilience side, and that's protecting the ocean to increase climate resilience. You may have heard about an executive order that was adopted very early in this administration, kind of directing agencies to come up with the ways in which the U.S. can conserve at least 30% of U.S. land and oceans by 2030, the so-called 30 by 30. That's domestic, but we're also looking to protect waters or the ocean internationally. And I'll just give one example of that. The U.S. is supporting and recently announced co-sponsorship of some of these, 3 proposals for marine protected areas in the Antarctic region in the Southern Ocean under the so-called CAMLR Treaty, which some of you may be familiar with. The 2 that we're co-sponsoring are in the Weddell Sea and East Antarctica. And we're also kind of out there calling on members of that treaty, CAMLR members, to adopt these 3 proposals at the next meeting, which should take place in the fall. So that's something we're doing to promote resilience, not just the mitigation side of the equation. And then the third thing, and I'm going to use the word silo again, which seems to be a very, very popular word with everyone else. But over the last couple of years, even when I was not back at the State Department, I was sort of on a campaign to try to break down silos. And I said it's time that we get rid of these silos, which have been really pernicious in the international treaty and international organization realm. So there's been a growing movement in the climate space, so under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, to try to do a better job of integrating ocean issues into kind of our climate world. A group was set up called Friends of the Ocean and Climate. You can tell from the name what it's about. And given the magnitude of the impacts of climate on the ocean and the possibility or the power of potential ocean solutions, the idea was these should not be just treated in vacuums, but we need to bring ocean considerations and kind of equities into the climate space. At the COP, I guess a year and a half ago in Madrid, it was called the Blue COP. Chile was hosting it and really put this forward as a priority for them. The first decision was ever taken that provided sort of significant amount of language on this issue of kind of the nexus between climate and ocean issues. A dialogue was called for. You may say, well, a dialogue, that doesn't sound like much given the enormity of the problem and the linkages. But in my world, that was a big deal. And that took place in the fall. And one of our goals for the COP that's coming up in Glasgow is to not let that dialogue be kind of a one-time event, but we want to carry forward this interaction between ocean and climate, into the future of the climate regime. And I should say, we don't think of this as just a one-way street where the climate regime takes into account ocean considerations. We're also working in ocean fora to make sure that they, take into consideration climate considerations or climate equities. So, we used to say that in the olden days, an ocean meeting was an ocean meeting and a climate meeting was a climate meeting, and never the twain shall meet. And we should never let that happen again. Every time we go to a climate meeting, we should be thinking about the ocean aspects of what we're deciding or ignoring, and vice versa. On your last point, which is what are we doing for countries sort of impacted by U.S. emissions, historical emissions, I guess. Well, the U.S. has been an active supporter financially and otherwise of countries affected by climate change, and President Biden most recently at the summit announced increased U.S. support for adaptation and resilience. Thanks.
Sarah, can I make a quick comment on that? Because I think my friends who are serving in the administration are doing even more. You asked a really important question that relates to issues of equity and justice, which is to what matters are cumulative emissions. 25% of those come from the United States, 2% from the continent of Africa. When you think about what it means to help deal with that moving forward, part of it is the impacts of climate we're already facing and are going to increasingly face moving forward. Part of it is helping think about what feasible, affordable, achievable pathways toward deep decarbonization look like for parts of the world that are going to, and we want them to, be enjoying significant rates of economic growth, and historical economic growth means more energy use, and that's probably not going to change. We want to invest in efficiency too, but as prosperity rises, they will be using more energy. A key part of that is the innovation we're talking about. It's the work Jigar and many others here do every day, because some of these technologies we have readily available to invest, say, in renewable energy if we're expanding the use of electricity, not just electricity access to charge a cell phone, but like real electricity use for economic development and potentially industrialization. But many of the technologies don't yet. And if we're going to think about tools like hydrogen and carbon capture or green ammonia in shipping or anything else, simply investing in those technologies with the countries that have the resources to do it through things like mission innovation, to put those technologies on a pathway where 5 or 10 years from now, it looks feasible, affordable to get on a lower carbon trajectory for those harder to abate sectors, the way it does today for electricity because of work we did 10 or 15 years ago, not just in the US, but elsewhere. That's a really important priority. And I think it is a critical piece of climate leadership, in addition to the climate diplomacy Sue and Secretary Kerry and everyone else does every day. Investing in innovation and technology, R&D and deployment is part of climate leadership.
I think we've hit our 1 hour mark. So I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone. It's a very wide-ranging conversation. Makes sense because the oceans cover the vast majority of our planet's surface, so give us a lot to talk about. But thank you again for participating, and I hope that the Mission Innovation attendees take something away from it.